Jai Ma, everyone, welcome. We are here today in our final session of our Swadhyay, our contemplation companion study of Nirvana Shatakam. And this is a very special session because this verse is, after so many lines and lines of letting go of who we are, this verse is going to describe to us what remains, the deepest self. So this will be a beautiful moment to just rest in our inner awareness through today's session today. So I'd like to invite you to join me for our opening prayer as we just invoke gratitude, reverence, and awareness of this wisdom. So you can join me by singing along, by chanting along, by just listening, by reading, however feels comfortable for you. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Om Shanti Prakashaya Namaha. Om Ayodhyanathaya Namaha. Om Shunyacharya Namaha. Om Atmatattvam Namaha. Om Vidyatattvam Namaha. Om Suryaya Namaha. Hari Om Tat Sat. Wonderful. So, as I mentioned, this verse 6, we've gotten to experience many letting go, many seeing through, many identities, attachments, layers that we were carrying over ourselves. And now that we reach this conclusion of this short, small, but mighty text, we see what is that presence that's left. So this is the one verse of the 6 that gives an affirmation of who we are, says it in the positive, says it in the what it is, rather than describing who we are based on what we are not. So that's the unique aspect of this verse. And it describes how we are one with Atman, one with Brahman. What is that self that we hold? So let's begin by looking at this verse 6. I'll share my screen here and you can read along with it. We'll also ask it to be placed in the chat for you as well, so you can read along there as we work through today. So verse 6 begins. Aham. This word aham means I am. So here we're for the first time hearing aham, what I am. Aham nirvikalpo nirakara rupo vibhutvacha sarvatra sarvendriyanam nacha sangatam neva muktir nameyaha chidananda rupa shivoham shivoham. And our translation here for verse 6 is saying, I am devoid of duality. My form is formlessness. I exist everywhere, pervading all the senses. Neither am I attached, neither free, nor captive. I am the ever pure, blissful consciousness. I am Shiva. I am Shiva. Shivoham, Shivoham. So this is what we are gifted from the spontaneous utterance of Adi Shankaracharya. When asked, who are you? He says, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this. I am this. And were these words to come from just anyone on the road, we would think they're a bit off. Like something is a little, wires aren't connecting. I am formlessness. I am, I am free. I am not free. all these words wouldn't make sense. But in the consciousness of a person who has let go of all that they are not, and for us as students who've been tracking the context of this, there are some beautiful gems in here, and we see what it's rooted in. That it's rooted in self-identity, but not the ego. The personality, the ego is not this description. He's describing something deeper, beyond, and transcendent. So in that context, we will be able to make sense of this. We will be able to make sense of this. Keeping in mind as we even look at this sixth verse, it's a continuation really of the process that we have been doing. So our method for the first 5 verses has been we are shedding who we are not to find out who we are. We are not accumulating more adjectives, accumulating more ideals to become. We are not accumulating more descriptions of who we should be, who we could be, who we might be. We're just letting go. So this is a shedding process with these verses. So even when you read this verse 6, for us as spiritual aspirants, for us on a journey of self-awakening, we're not in that established awareness that Adi Shankaracharya was living in. We're on the way, we're in process. So even as you read these words, remember that they are not to be added on. They are not to be come a new identity we're trying to fit ourselves into. They're simply a description of what's remaining after we've done it, after we've done all the shedding. What presence is there underneath everything that we've fully shed? So this is knowing that this is a continuation of that same process, shedding but not accumulating. So let's look at these words. Let's take them step by step. In this first line, we see this word nirvikalpo. In Acharya Shunya Satsanga on this verse, she tells us that the first part, nir, N-I-R, means beyond. And vikalpa means these fluctuations of the mind. So here we're being told that the essence of who we are is beyond the mind, is the sakshi, the witnessing observer. We're beyond being split up by thoughts. So this is the description here. Remember how in verse 1, we negated our thoughts, we negated our mind. We were reminded that I am not my mind, isn't it? And here in verse 6, we're hearing the reminder that I'm the observer of those thoughts. So I'm not the mind, but I'm beyond the mind. I'm that quiet, unperturbed, unfluctuating presence against which all these machinations of the mind occur. I am that vast field of awareness within which these waves rise and fall. So the thoughts cannot contain or even conceive of or wrap themselves around that field of awareness. Yet the field of awareness can hold all of those thoughts. The other component here is that the thoughts, the waves of thoughts, don't alter the field. They're just witnessed, the field of awareness. They're just registered and noticed, observed by that observing presence. So when we say beyond the mind, it's partly this idea that we are simply an observer of the mind and all of its tumblings. The idea also of being beyond the mind is again a reminder that we can't think or study or cognize our way to the self. This state that we're trying to connect, re-remember the self, it's beyond the mind. It's so far beyond the mind. The mind is so limited and and has a lot of, it breaks everything up and categorizes everything in an effort to understand what's happening in the transactional world. But the self is beyond all those categorizations, beyond all those fragmentations that the mind does. It's beyond our mental and intellectual constructs. So once we negate and see through all the layers that we've unpeeled in these last 5 verses, the state we're left with is wordless. It's indescribable. It's even beyond the mind's comprehension, is something that we're left with. So nirvikalpo, beyond the mind. And as we're thinking, just the function of the mind, it's so useful as a tool, as a functional component for us to operate in this transactional reality. Because it concretizes, it freezes things so that we can process them mentally. It gives name and form to experiences. It articulates ideas. It names emotions and deliberates on why and how they've arisen. It logs all of our memories so that we're able to learn from our mistakes. We're able to orient ourselves inside of space and time because we have this mind which is doing all these functions. And in the process of that, its natural form and function of the mind, it gives rise to this duality, to a separation between things. This is an apple and this is an orange. Right now it's morning, it's going to be night later. It tells us what is happening, and it draws these distinctions between things so that we can process it. But we're here reminded that the self is beyond that function, how limited that function is, useful, vital for us as a human being, and yet not at all the self. The self is fully beyond that. And many of these, in this 6th verse, we'll hear some of these words that maybe at first feel like I can't imagine sitting with myself and fully being able to experience, oh, I'm beyond the mind. Like that feels a bit distant, that feels a bit intangible. It's hard to imagine ourselves being in that, established in that kind of awareness. But actually, we sometimes feel flickers of these truths. And we can continue to investigate this with the rest of the words in this verse, but sometimes we do see for ourselves small flashes of these things resonating as true within us. Um, Even though we're not fully established in that Shiva identity, we get peeks at it. So for this word, it makes me think of when we feel resistant to the idea of being labeled. We feel a discomfort when we feel like we're being boxed or limited. Um, we reject being limited to like 1 or 2 categories. We at some point feel this desire to be seen and understood as multifaceted. I am nuanced. I am multidimensional. So when I feel that impulse, and I hear this from many people, this impulse to want to be seen in all of their complexity and not just simplified down into a few categories. I think it shows an inner impulse. It hints at a memory we have of knowing that we are unfragmented deep within. We want to be seen in our wholeness. We want to experience this comprehensive, integrated sense of self. And so we try very much in the day-to-day world to struggle and push and pull to present ourselves in a way and be understood in our relationships in this way. But at the core of it, that impulse, that desire to be seen in our wholeness without fragmentation seems to hint at this inner truth that I'm beyond all labels and categorizations. That in truth, I am one continuous presence. Another way I see a glimmer of this truth. Sometimes we wish we could kind of just shut our mind off. You know, the mind, it's buzzing and buzzing and buzzing, and it's having ups and downs, and it's running its own whirlpools. And sometimes it feels cloudy, and sometimes it feels clear. And sometimes we want to just, there's so much going on in there. We want to just dial it down and let it be silent, you know? I feel that hints at a yearning for this aspect of our deepest self, which is we're wanting to step away from the mind's fluctuations and abide in that place which is serene, calm, unaffected by all of these vibrations of the mind. We want to come back to that presence which is below and beyond our thoughts. I'm sure all of us have at some point had a desire to just go beyond our thoughts. And that impulse, again, is a clue, is a small confirmation that some part of us still remembers that there is this part of us that is not caught up in all the thoughts, but is beyond them. So these are the ways I contemplate on nirvikalpo. What is that part of me yearning to go beyond my thoughts? And we can practice touching that space within us. We can let ourselves drop in to that awareness of beyond thoughts. And we do that by simply observing and witnessing. So you may have a practice like this. And Acharya Shunya has guided us through contemplations and witnessing meditations where we become still and we just observe the thoughts as they arise. And we simply look at those thoughts as waves, as fluctuations. And you can do it now, even if you want. You can just observe that activity that is mentally occurring all the time. It's all the time. Even when we're dreaming, our mind is active. And when we look at those thoughts, seeing them as simply ripples, there's this still lake of our mind, and each thought is just a ripple casting out small, small fluctuations. And we can practice simply observing the thoughts, those ripples, as they are, just watching them, letting them be. Not judging them, not saying they're categorizing them as good or bad, not trying to slow them and stop them, not trying to encourage ourselves to have more sattvic thoughts, to have more noble thoughts. We simply just notice and observe. And this is a beautiful process to do when you feel like the mind is racing. It's a beautiful process to do when you find a few quiet moments and want to just re-center and come back to the self. So after you spend a few minutes just observing those thoughts, you then invite yourself to become aware of the presence within that is doing the observing. I mean, doing the observing isn't even the right word. That is just aware. That is just witnessing. And as we become aware of the ripples of thoughts, and we become aware of that consciousness within that is simply observing those thoughts, a small gap begins to open between what we're observing and ourself as the observer. And here in that small gap, one thing that emerges is an awareness of a presence inside of us that is nirvikalpa, that is beyond those thoughts. So this is a deeply soothing and grounding and a coming home way to, inspired by this description of the self, that it's nirvikalpa, beyond the fluctuations of the mind. We can touch that space inside of us. Beautiful. Then the next word we're given in verse 6 is nirakara rupo. Nir again comes beyond. Akara rupo means shape or form. So it means I am formless. So here it's saying, if I say I have this form, that's limiting. And it's saying that me, my deepest self, which we hear is one with Atma, Brahman, is here, but it's not there because I said it's this form. It makes static something that is vastly dynamic. It limits and boxes something that is constantly creating and regenerating. So this idea of formless means it hasn't been caught up into a form. It can take any shape, any form. It's present in all forms because it has no one specific form. And this relates to the third term we're given, this vibhutvacha sarvatra. So it's all pervading everywhere. So it's formless, the self is formless and all pervading, meaning present in everything. Existing everywhere, pervading all. So when we take together these two descriptions of our formlessness and our all-pervadingness, together these two bring us to an understanding that we are, our essence, our self is boundless, expansive, infinite, spacious. And take a moment to juxtapose that with how often we feel bound, how often we may feel tight, how often we feel like finite. This is the limit of me and who I am and what I can do. This is telling us, no, that may be true for the ego and that may be true for you as a human being inside your life setup, but your essence, your self, your Atma is formless and all pervading. And I want to place a few contemplation questions for you. One is, when you do this neti practice, these first 5 verses invited us to point out with a laser-like precision all these different aspects of a human life that we get identified with and say, but I'm not that. So when you do this process of methodically pinpointing and saying, I'm not that, and you set aside these attachments, these identifications that you had with the mind and the body and the roles you play and the where you are in society. Perhaps you've experimented with this practice by now that we've reached this series. When you neti practice, when you let go of these attachments, do you feel more expansive or do you feel more contracted? So think back anytime you've practiced this neti or heard it described or been guided through it. Do you feel more expansive when you let go of some of these identities? Or do you feel more contracted? What about when you sit in meditation and the body and the mind and the breath and the emotions naturally become less distracting. They become somewhat calmer, more easeful. In that state of quiet, inner observation, of just simple meditation, in that moment, do you feel more expanded or more contracted? How about when you read or listen to a satsanga? Some teacher's teaching that is telling you about this transcendent, ever-present presence within you. When you're hearing these kind of deep spiritual truths about who you really are, do you feel more expansive and light? Do you feel more contracted and heavy? These are the neti neti practice, the sitting in meditation, the hearing or reading wisdom, satsanga. These are all ways in this transactional world that we come back to who we are. We come back to ourselves. We remind ourselves who we really are. And it's almost like the closer the mind gets, the more the mind begins to reflect our deeper truth. Something, we feel an expansiveness, no? When you feel that expansiveness, do you also feel that inner knowingness of like, ah, okay, yes, I'm coming closer. We feel like I'm coming closer. This feels authentic to me. This feels true to me. I feel that maybe this is who I really am, and I'm not this person that's running around trying to do all the things at once. I feel like in this quiet stillness, yeah, this is who I really am. We feel a recognition start to dawn inside of us. And it may be temporary, maybe during the contemplation or during the meditation or during the satsanga, and we may forget the moment we walk outside the room again. But in those moments when we're receiving reminders, when we're orienting ourselves to that inner inquiry of who we really are, expansiveness happens, is it not? So this again is one of these small glimmers on our spiritual journey that gives us a hint, gives us a experience of this truth that Adi Shankaracharya has described for us so beautifully. That we are formless and we are all pervading. We are everywhere. We are just ongoing and expansive. And so that experience can be uh, an affirmation for us, a reconfirmation for us that we're orienting toward self-awareness as we have that. Yeah. And then we hear towards the end of the second line here that he says that the self, that I am sarvendriyanam, I am flowing through all the senses. I am the intelligence in all the senses. And previously we looked at the senses. We negated the senses as well. Earlier in this text, we looked at what are the senses? Am I only what I can taste, touch, smell, see, hear? Am I only these things? Is my only job to chase gratification for these senses? No, no, no. I'm not that. I'm not that. I'm not that. I'm not the senses. So here we're being shown that there is this intelligence, this conscious awareness that is activating, that is animating, that is lending its brilliance and intelligence and consciousness to the senses. So beautiful to sit with that idea of when I see something, I'm seeing through the power, through the Shakti, through the intelligent awareness of my deepest self. When I taste something, when I hear something, letting each sensory expression, sensory input be a reminder of the self within and its light that is making everything around me perceptible. So this is one way to bring this idea of sarvendriyanam, that the self, my deepest self, my atma is flowing through all my senses, is the intelligence within all my senses. It changes our appreciation for our senses, uh, and gives us a very practical moment-to-moment way to continue coming back to the self. It helps balance our senses, knowing that they're not pulling us to the world, but there's this intelligent presence within that can guide them that gives them the power to do what they do. So our relationship with our senses changes when we know that I am not the senses, but I am that intelligence flowing through them. And then finally in this, before the refrain, in the third line, we receive what is just probably my favorite line of the whole verse, where Adi Shankaracharya says, Nacha sangatam neva muktir nameyaha. So this means that nacha we've seen frequently, and neither sangatam, attached. Naiva means neither, muktir, I'm not even free. Nameyaha, I'm not bound or I'm not captive. And this is so interesting, isn't it? Not attached, okay, we can imagine that, but not free. That seems a bit, okay, let's sit with that. Let's try to unpack that a little bit. And I'm not captive. Huh, interesting. Okay, let's look at that word too. So this line reminds us that despite how the human experience so often makes us feel that we are just attached to it, that the world has so much power over us, that's pulling us in so many directions, and we are powerless to cut those ties. We don't know how, we don't know if we should, we know we have to stay engaged, but it feels so sticky, the world. We feel so attached to the world. Then he says about neither am I, he says that I was never attached. I was never attached. So we think that we are attached and we have to do this niti niti. I'm not attached to this. I'm not attached to this relationship, not attached to this part of the world. But he's saying you were never attached. The self was never entangled. And when that lands with me, I think, oh, how much time I spent in this lifetime and in many, many other lifetimes being so attached. And then how much effort and learning and practice I spent to try and disentangle those attachments, to transcend those attachments. And now he's telling us, oh, my dear, you are never attached. The self, the Atma is never attached. The mind is attached, the ego is attached, the self is never attached. And just as that moment of, oh, I'm free, hits us, he comes with this next word, neither am I free. So we feel this relief knowing we were never attached. And he says, but you were also never free. And it makes sense because to be free means there has to be something that was keeping us bound. To be free means we're getting free from something. That there was a time or a person or a object or a circumstance that had us contained. But he's reminding us here, and this always makes me smile when I hear this word, that I'm not free. Neither am I free. Meaning, uh, there's nothing to be free from. This idea of freedom and not free, it's a moot point. Just you can't be free because you were never attached. And the final word, maya, bound or captive. It's so easy, it's so common that we feel like I'm stuck in this job. I'm trapped by my responsibilities to my family, to the elders in my life who are aging, to my career, which I have to maintain to sustain my life, sustain my family, sustain myself. I'm trapped in this maybe a physical illness that I have, a chronic disease which I can't shake and can't be free of, and so it's limiting me in some way. And he's saying the self is not captive. Yes, the ego, the body, the mind, there may be limitations. There may be only so much we're capable of, so many opportunities we receive because of our karmic situations, because of our past choices, because of the circumstances we're born into. Sure, yeah, but the self, all those cages we think are around us, the self is not contained in any of those. In fact, the self is all pervading. The self is infused even in those things we think were keeping us in bondage. So even the things, taking the previous line into context, where we say it's all pervading, even the things that seem to be our captors, our cages, yet those are infused with the self, are infused with Brahman. So it's very easy in our spiritual journey to get wrapped up in thinking of it as a struggle to break free of our self-sabotaging habits, to to break free of our codependency in relationships, to finally muster some willpower over our senses. Sometimes we think of our spiritual journey as this effortful uphill battle between our highest self and the ignorance that is blocking it from our experience. Sometimes our spiritual journey feels like it's full of striving, forward looking, future looking. I'm not there yet, but maybe with more effort, or maybe with more surrender, maybe with more practices, I'll get there. Some place and some time in the future, we place our self with a capital S. We also get wrapped up in our spiritual journey thinking it's linear, that there is a process, and that we're monitoring how far am I moving ahead and how far am I slipping back? Where is my setbacks? So we're trying to track ourselves along that journey. Or in our spiritual journey, also, we're trying to escape the world. We're trying to unlock the cage and break out of it. We're saying if I leave this job, if I leave this relationship, if I go on this week-long retreat and just set aside all the things that are the trappings of my world, keeping me stuck, holding me back, distracting me from my spiritual journey, then I'll experience this freedom that I'm seeking. So this verse wipes all of that aside. And it tells us that to know the self, we merely have to set all of that down. Just let it go. Because the truth that is the self, beyond our thoughts, formless, all pervading, the intelligence animating our senses. It is already and always was here, right now. And in fact, the idea that we have to get free, that we are attached, that we're bound and have to find release, that's still within the construct of the ego. This entire setup that we have to transcend attachments and achieve freedom from bondage, it's a moot point, Adi Shankaracharya is telling us. For the self, there's really no journey. It has nowhere to go and nowhere to arrive. In fact, this line implies something really profound about our spiritual journey, which is it implies the idea even that we are on a journey to seek the self, and that we are waiting and waiting for the self to stand in front of us and reveal itself to us, that yearning for the self to show up can sometimes be a barrier to realizing the self. Do you know what I mean? Whereas we have to flip that and know and remember that the self is not going to show up in front of us. The self is going to, when we let go of the effort and the struggle, the self will be revealed from within. It's already here. And please also understand that the idea of a journey toward the self can be very useful at certain points, can keep us oriented toward a goal. Because who's taking this journey? And Acharya Shunya beautifully commented on this in her question and answer session around these teachings. But I loved it when she said, who's taking this journey? It's not the self. The self is not taking the journey. It's not my highest self going on a long pilgrimage to reunite with itself. It's the mind that's taking this journey. It's my ego that's taking this journey. So the idea of a journey is something to keep the mind motivated, the ego, kept at a manageable size and well behaved and in service of our self-reclamation or recognition. But eventually, after Adi Shankaracharya is fully established in himself, he tells us that there is nowhere to go. There is no destination to find. We always were where we are trying to reach. These words in this verse, when we think of them on the level of the mind, all of the words in verse 6, when we try to crack them on the level of the mind, they can feel like a puzzle, kind of a slippery puzzle, and but what about this? But what about that? Um, but they're best experienced when you just let them echo in the cave of your own heart and notice how they land. I can give you now um, some suggested contemplations that you might sit with to just begin to entertain this possibility of this as a truth, that I am not attached, nor am I free, nor am I in bondage. So I wonder if you'd like to sit with these for a moment. First, these are the kinds of thoughts I have when I take one of these words, I'm not attached. And my way of sitting with these words is I am not attached. Okay, let me just sit with that word. I am not attached. Now, what comes up as I let that word echo, echo, echo inside of me? So here's some I'll offer to you, and as you work with it, your own unique words will emerge. So when I remember that I am not attached, I remember that I am not my likes or dislikes. I am not my roles and responsibilities, my habits and patterns. The world is not grasping onto me, and I am not grasping onto the world. My relationships are not clinging onto me, and I am not clinging to my relationships. I open my clutching palms and find that there is a witnessing part of me that was never attached to any of it. Taking it further, letting go of my attachments doesn't make me free. To be free means that there is a part of me in bondage, something I had to be free from. I need not escape anything. There was nothing to reject or protect myself from. My essence is freedom. I'm beyond even the idea of freedom. And I let the idea of being just even beyond the idea of freedom, I let that echo inside of me. Then I remember myself transcends all boundaries, bondages. I'm limitless. I'm not defined by the categories of my ego self. I'm the intelligence operating through my body, mind, and senses in the transactional world. But they do not define or bind me in any way. I'm not a captive or a victim of my mind or circumstances. I am ever free. Freedom is my nature. So, like this, these are some of the ways that we can engage with this verse 6. As we've discussed many times, these 6 verses are the utterance of a self-awakened soul. And they're not meant to be a curriculum for us necessarily to follow. But when we hear the sounds of what someone who is established in their deepest self, when we hear the sounds of what they would use to describe it, it might awaken something within us. And so we can sit with them. Even if it's not our reality today, we can warm up to the idea and see what softens, what opens, what shifts, what awakens. And of course, this verse, like all the others, concludes with that refrain, Chidananda Rupa, Shivoham, Shivoham. I am that just consciousness and bliss. I am that Shiva. I am that Shiva. So a few concluding components here is that this verse, it describes as best words can our true nature that has become somewhat obscured, but we've not totally forgotten because we yearn for it. And we discussed in the beginning earlier in the session of these glimmers that we see of how I really am yearning for that part of myself that is beyond the mind, that is free. And theoretically, at this point, you're experimenting with the Neti Neti practice. You've been experimenting with loosening your ties to certain kinds of attachments, certain identities, certain associations. And let's keep in mind as we gather up all the gems we've received from these satsangas, from these contemplations, let them become a new framework for our process. Remembering that the self is not doing the negating, it's the mind that's cleaning itself out all along, that's streamlining its structure, that's taking these teachings and reconstructing a new idea of who we really are, that's disentangling all those threads that it's wound itself up in. And I'm curious that when you look at your spiritual journey that way, as an evolution of the mind, a clearing away of attachments that are held in the mind, a letting go of perceptions of bondages that are only entangling us in the mind. When we let go of this desire for freedom from something that we were never trapped in anyway, I'm curious to know, how does your relationship to your journey change? What is that dynamic like? How do you orient yourself to your spiritual journey in light of the arc we've been taken on in this text? That I feel is something for you to sit with and contemplate independently. Remember also that this text is a tool up until it's a description of ourselves as an awakened being. So Acharya Shunya described beautiful ways where she has evolved in her use of this text. In her final session, she described how this text can sometimes, as we become familiar with it, there are many ways we can continue to engage with it. We can continue to read it regularly. We can find a recording and listen to those words just to bring us back into that remembrance. And we can also, as she shared, she earlier would read through all the text to really integrate those words. But then later, sometimes a single line or a single word would pop up as just the right reminder in day-to-day life to come back, releasing attachments and just revealing the self. So you can use this kind of method in your own journey. So when you find yourself um, seeking clarity again, seeking to kind of get back oriented into where you're going, what you're doing, where the mind is going, what the mind is doing, this text can support you. I'll give two just kind of day-to-day examples of how this text can be influential and instrumental in our transactional world. Let's say you have challenges with body image, with jealousy of others' physical appearances. Now we're all on a spiritual path, but yet we also have these small, unwanted thoughts and habits of thinking that occur inside of us. We start to wish ours was different, wish it was this way, that way. We can come back to that reminder in verse 2. I am not these body tissues, which can just relax the importance that you're giving to that physical body. I'm not these tissues. These are just like, I'm just like bags of fluids and some pieces of meat, you know? I'm not these tissues. That's not who I am. And then in verse 3, recall, we can release ourselves of guilt over having jealous thoughts by remembering that I, the self, am not colored by these emotions. So in there was listed, I'm not those feelings of jealousy. So, okay, now we self-soothe, remembering, yes, it's true, that thought arose in me, but I am not those thoughts. So my self is still intact and unharmed, unlabeled, unboxed, uncolored by that experience, by that feeling, that emotion. So like that, we can cherry pick these words that help us. Maybe if you have trouble controlling the senses, scrolling without control on the phone, or binge eating foods that are not beneficial for you, or binge watching media or something that is not making you feel good. Remembering, oh, I am not my senses. Verse 1. Oh, my senses are out there. I'm not my senses. This is not who I am. And in fact, I am the intelligence that is even animating these senses. Verse 6 can bring more detachment and consciousness to how you use your senses. So by reviewing these verses, these words get very familiar to us. And then in the moment, in the course of our day-to-day lives, they come to our aid. They come to serve us. They come as reminders. So that is one benefit of increasing our familiarity with these texts. They give us relief in the moment while we're exposing ourselves to them. We feel like we're drinking deeply from a sweet, sweet well of truth. And they strengthen and illumine and support us in the chaos of transactional reality. And the more we're familiar with them, the more they spontaneously emerge and come to our aid when needed, when we need them. So the invitation here is to continue sitting with this text. Let it reverberate through you. You can memorize it if you wish, but even better is to let each word sink in. Let it echo. Let it just resonate inside. You're also welcome to rewatch Acharya Shunya's satsangas. You're welcome to revisit these Swadhyay companion study sessions. So these resources continue to be available for you. So we have reached now the conclusion of this journey. And I want to give my deep gratitude and pranam to my teacher Acharya Shunya, to her guru, Baba Ayodhyanath, to his guru, Shanti Prakash Acharya. These teachings are so valuable. And any mistakes, any lack of clarity, any misspoken words, errors that have happened in any of these sessions, those come from my just partial understanding of all of this. But I am grateful that there are beings like our guru, like this lineage teachers, who know that true essence, not only from an intellectual space, but a deeply lived and experiential space. And so I give my gratitude to them for sharing these teachings with us. And we have, through these satsangas, through this contemplation, we are receiving also benefits from hundreds of years ago, from these retained syllables from Adi Shankaracharya. And so for his gifts and blessings, I feel such a gratitude as well. And as we close, it's just remarkable to me that Ishvara has allowed and conspired and supported us to be able to meet for these 8 sessions. I think it's miraculous of all the things happening in the world, that whether it's through live, whether it's through video, whatever it is, we've been supported. We've been deeply supported that we could have this time together and make this occur. It wasn't us. It was Ishvara's grace that allowed these sessions to happen. So we've been guided divinely throughout. Yeah. Om Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha. So with that, we'll close. And I invite you to join me in our closing prayer. You can read along, you can chant along. Join me on an inhalation. Om. Asato ma satgamaya. Tamaso ma jyotirgamaya. Mrityorma amritam gamaya. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om peace, peace, peace. Jai Ma, everyone. Thank you for your presence. Many, many blessings on your journey with this text. And we will meet again very soon inside a Vedic Study Circle. Jai Ma, take care.